Hi, I want to welcome the conference attendees to this conversation. My name is Scot Safon, and I'm a brand communications consultant. I was formerly, over the many decades, the chief marketing officer at CNN, at TNT, the Weather Channel, and at Motor Trend. So I love consulting with brands in the media space and outside of the media space. Feels like every brand these days feels that they're a media brand. Anyway, in this conversation, we'll be talking about how you, as a decision maker or just a decision influencer, can navigate this very chaotic, fast changing world we're all living in by staying ahead of the cultural curve. It's a hugely important topic, and we're lucky to have one of the country's foremost experts on culture and its importance, Linda Ong. She's the founder of CULTIQUE, one of the market's top consultants and advisors on this topic. She'll share ideas and perspectives that business decision makers can use to manage through these very dramatic cultural shifts that affect your consumers, your colleagues, and your employees. Feel free to add comments to the chat as we go. And also, Linda and her team would love to hear what you think about what we're talking about at their Instagram account, which is at cultique.co. And remember on all of this to hashtag elevate for the conference. Anyway, let's start. Linda, some of the world's leading entertainment, lifestyle, and retail brands engage you and your team at Cultique to help them figure out how to understand and act on what's happening in the larger culture. So, before we get into other questions, tell us a little bit about Cultique and what you and your team are doing for these clients.
Sure. Well, thank you. And thank you to the organizers for inviting us to be here. It's a pleasure to speak with all of you. I think of culture in somewhat metaphorical terms because it's a very abstract idea for most people. But I think the way that has been sort of clearest to think about it is to think about it sort of like weather systems. So I like to use the analogy of our clients. When they come to us, they're sort of in the rocket building and launching business. So, we even marketers use the term launch when they're starting a new campaign or introducing a new product. So if you envision yourself as on a team of rocket scientists, literally in the best sense, one thing you will know is that as much as you are going to be using data and past performance and looking for patterns and finding the smartest and the brightest people to build your rocket, what you really, really need at the end of the day is someone to measure the atmosphere. What is going on? What are the atmospheric conditions that can either help or hinder the successful launch and meeting of your goals? And today, what we know is that there's so many examples every day of when somebody doesn't pay attention to the atmosphere. That's called being tone deaf, right? And that a lot of marketers have good intentions. The famous example of this, which we didn't work on, was Kendall Jenner's Pepsi ad. The idea of sort of showing, an effort to cross over conflict using a soft drink was probably a noble idea in the creative room. But what happens when it got out to culture was that people said, you're trivializing what's really going on with police brutality. And how can you, use this as a moment to capitalize on people's pain? And there was just sort of this understanding that anytime a new message is entering the market, there has to be an important analysis of how that message will get received, especially when people are spending millions or billions of dollars on product development or marketing or branding. It is an obligation, I would believe today, to understand how that message will be received. And that's really what we do in culture.
I mean, there's sort of two sides to this. You want to avoid the disaster, and or the tragedy of being tone deaf, but at the same time, you want to find the opportunity that's there too, and speak to that
Sure.
and meet the moment. I think that a lot of leaders would probably say they want to stay on top of culture, and it's very important to them, and they have to understand it and use it in their business planning. But how the question winds up being like, businesses aren't typically structured to just take in the culture. So how should they operationalize it? Like what would a business do first to try to
Yeah.
get ready for that?
Great question. Well, I think also let's take a step back, talk about the word culture because it's used interchangeably in two ways. One is to describe internal culture, right, which is the values and belief systems and practices of an organization. And those values are today what are driving consumers to make decisions when they have an abundance of choice. So if they have two competitors that have virtually the same kind of product, they may make their decision based on what are the values, what are the belief systems of this company, and how do they act on it? Not just what do they say, but what are they actually doing to bring their values to life? So there's an internal culture, and then there's external culture, which is really the product of civilization. So that could be media, could be pop culture, could be art, fashion, music, sports, news. It could be the way physical design manifests, like a restaurant design or a gym design. We're seeing changes in vet designs because there's vet clinic designs because there's been so many, people adopting pets during the pandemic. So really what, I would say to your question about how can an organization stay on top of this is, I think one is you need to have someone in your organization that's designated to really be on top of culture. And that could be the CEO, that could be the head of marketing, the head of research, but it could also be, I'm really advocating chief culture officers in organizations because the world is changing so fast and every individual's view of culture is different based on their personal upbringing, their lived experience, where they live right now, even whether you're coastal or in the middle of the country. So I think it's really important to understand that an organization needs to have a cohesive point of view on culture. That's what we do. We craft bespoke perspectives. So it's almost like if you think of every kind of topic that is animating people in culture, whether it's the new Sopranos movie coming out, or it's politics, or it's climate change, or whatever. These are all conversations that happen in the ecosystem of culture. And whether that's internal or external is sort of like the second level, but it's, we all know these conversations. It doesn't matter. It's not about in or out or good or bad. These conversations are happening and you need a POV in order to separate the signal from the noise, right? And so your brand and your brand's objectives and your brand's customers have to be kind of the Venn diagram filter for how you look at culture. That's what we do. Whenever we work with, travel brands or media brands or retail brands, and we're always looking at the same culture, but then it's like, what's the lens into it that will help us curate the conversations that are really important that you should listen to? Because then it's about looking for how are those conversations changing. And to your point, Scott, about how do you get ahead of the curve, is if you focus on where those conversations are changing, you can anticipate where those shifts are going to be before the mainstream has even acknowledged it. So I'll give you a great example. We worked in 2014 with a television network executive you actually know and love. And we were doing a presentation on the state of television drama at the time. And at that point, it was around 2014 in the fall, in February of 2014, Netflix had dropped House of Cards. In the fall of 2014, it started picking up steam. There was a lot of buzz. And we were presenting in the fall and we were talking about binge viewing and talking about how people were so excited to be able to see all these, so novel to be able to see, 13 episodes at once over a weekend. And the president said, I hear you, that people are excited, but the numbers don't hold up, right? The data is not telling us that people are binge viewing as much as they're talking about it. And so my 29-year-old analyst looked at this, storied network executive and said very nicely, and how come everybody knows what a spoiler alert is, right? Which is only if you had been in the conversation of binge viewing that you understand what a spoiler alert is. And the point of her comment was, well, he backed down, by the way. The point of her comment was that many times before there's a shift in behavior, and I would say probably the majority of time today, that there's a shift in behavior, it's always preceded in a shift in the conversation. And if you look for the shifts in the conversation, you can get ahead of the shift in behavior and even sometimes own the shift in behavior, leverage the shift in behavior, but culture can be a competitive advantage if you know how to use it.
So that's a fantastic point, and you said also something in that response that I find very interesting about looking for the signal inside the noise. There's an analogous situation in most businesses today where they've got more data than they know what to do with, and they're swimming in data. And they're looking for the signals inside the data. And that's why they hire data scientists and beef up their data analytics. And they're just desperately looking for it. So, a lot of, I think the tendency might be in some businesses to say, well, we do get our best consumer insights from the data. And how do you, as an advocate for cultural insights, kind of respond to that?
Sure. Well, I think that is a very common refrain. And I think what, if you understand, if you really double click on what data does, is data looks for patterns. Data looks for, human behavior where it's consistent. And if you think about the pandemic, what's probably happening now, and we're hearing it from a lot of our clients, is people are acting very inconsistently right now. So it's causing a big problem because a lot of our clients, and we work with tech firms, but what they're finding is the data is contradicting itself at times, and they can't make heads or tails of it. For example, we're working on a project about the movie going business, the theatrical business, which is having a really hard time dealing with the advent of streaming, especially in the pandemic. And it's not like people are 100%, only going to go to the movie theaters or I'm only going to go streaming. It's so dependent on so many factors. That can be what the COVID count is in your region. It can be who's in the movie. It can be how many, is this a franchise or is this a new thing? It can be, cultural factors. A group that's never been represented before, like Shang-Chi did fantastic at the theaters because people were like, I can't see this kind of Asian superhero in general, and I want to take my family and make it a communal experience. So I think what's happening is culture allows people to understand, allows us to understand why there's so many contradictions sometimes in data, but more importantly, to the point of the binge viewing comment, allows us to anticipate what's next. And data, again, because it's predicated on finding patterns, is only as good as the consistency of humans. And so that's why you have to have data and culture. Data is great at telling you what, culture tells you why. And if you know why, you can better anticipate if any changes that you might have to make or opportunities that you can take advantage of. And a lot of people today, we like to say, are information rich and insights poor.
Yeah, these are great points. I can't tell you the number of times where I've been in business situations over the decades where the result didn't happen the way the data said it was going to happen,
Right.
and the data was just
Well, and then
wrong.
people go, well, it's the data's fault. Right.
Right.
But data on its own is, it's just an indication. It's not an answer. And so you need humans, and you need to put that, again, we're not robots. We don't behave consistently every time. And so there's so many variables like weather, again, that's why I use the weather analogy. There's so many different systems that are pushing on each other, and culture is an ecosystem. And we now know that everything's related, right? Income inequality is related to climate change. All these things, politics and global, and the health and the way that societies are being constructed are all related to all these other factors, and you can't look at them independently in a silo anymore. I mean, look at even business travel or business. It's like, we talk about the big paradigm shift that has happened in these past 2 years, and there's been more change in the last 20 months than have been in the last 20 years, right? But the big paradigm shift that has happened is basically what we call downside up, is the world as it used to be in terms of systems and structures is now upside down. It used to be that your life had to revolve and fit around your work. But now we see, because of the advent of distributed workplaces, now the work has to fit around our desired lives, right? That's a complete inversion. It used to be that the center of power in an organization was the CEO. The CEO is still the leader, but the employees have the power now. So all these changes, there's a whole list of them. All these changes are 180, and it doesn't mean that they're going to be in effect tomorrow. But this is, this is a seismic cultural event that we're having right now, and it's going to have profound implications. And what I say to people is you either can hop on the wave and ride it, or, get washed out to sea or left on shore.
So you, oops, excuse me. So you made again a lot of great points, and you talked about the distributed workplace. It's so interesting. This another paradox maybe. Workplaces all over the world are empty. Physical workplaces are all over the world are empty. Yet we're talking more about workplace culture than ever, because it's important. It's important to retaining talents. It's important to getting the most out of people. It's important for making people comfortable in whatever stressed out situation they're dealing with right now. So talk a little bit about how culture relates to how your cultural insights relate to internal workplace culture.
Sure, sure. Do you want to turn the light on and then I'll answer
Yeah.
the question?
I don't know why it keeps breaking.
You're hopping on the
Got
cord. Okay.
it.
Yeah. So it's probably nowhere are these cultural forces more evident than in the conversations about work. You probably all read about the Great Resignation, where, figures like 40% of people don't want to return to the workplace. I've seen a study that said 44% of Gen Z would rather lose their right to vote than have to work in an office. These are really, again, seismic paradigm shifts, unlike anything what we've seen before. And so what's happening in the workplace is that there is a larger conversation outside of the workplace that is asking people or causing people to recalibrate their lives and causing them, I mean, it's very existential. We've known this for the last 2 years, but to really ask themselves, what is the value of work in my life? Yes, there's a monetary reward, but what we're seeing now on a massive scale, and it's everything, every study will show you it's everything from low income hourly wage workers to top senior executives, that there is really a kind of reckoning that the work culture in the before times was unsustainable, that it was unhelpful in terms of family life, society, that it was too capitalist focused in terms of taking away opportunities and money from people, in order to give those to people who already had a lot of privilege. So there is this right sizing or correction that's going on in the total. And again, this is where you can't silo work from life. Everything's intermixed, right? And so this reevaluation is really important for employers, because they're going to have to change, and many are already and have made amazing adaptations in the last year. But really, the best companies today are employee led, and it really recognizing we are in a very tight labor shortage. There are jobs, but according to studies, there are not people with the skill sets who want them. So there's a delta between sort of the skills people have, the jobs they want, and the jobs that are available. And so the only way, the only way in culture to really engage people right now is to meet them where they are. Not, I think, in the before times, I always talk about the before times, but in the paradigm before, jobs were, the shiny object on the hill, and everybody wanted them. Well, now it's people are the shiny object on the hill, and the organizations have to go after them. So, everything that probably all the people on this call are dealing with already, mental health policies, employee benefits, things like that, trying to create, we're actually looking into, 4-day work weeks, things like that, are really fundamental, because people are trying to negotiate and navigate the relationship between life and work, and life is winning, and employers need to recognize that.
So you mentioned this about people who people have responsibility on some level at a company for human resources, and probably that's almost everybody who works in a decision making capacity at a company should feel responsible for human resources. Um,
People.
so but ultimately this issue about culture and how and who should who should be accountable for culture or cultural importance in a company. Who do you where does it reside? I mean,
I
you
really
mentioned the
think,
chief cultural officer, but
yeah,
beyond
I really think it's the CEO's job because the CEO is the steward of the brand and the business and the culture and the internal. I think what the CEO is in charge of is managing the relationship between internal culture and external culture. So if you look back at the last 2 years, especially with Me Too and Black Lives Matter, there are a lot of CEOs who lost their jobs because their employees felt they were not upholding the internal culture and aligning it to the external culture. That is why people lost their jobs, because there is that relationship between internal and external. And I think CEOs really need to understand how critical it is to manage that relationship.
I've heard you talk about culture in a very interesting way. A construct, I guess, that you have for looking at it and your team has for looking at it, where you look at the residual, the dominant, and the emergent,
Hmm.
things going on in the culture. Could you explain it? Because I find it fascinating. It might be
Sure.
very helpful for our audience.
Sure. Well, if you remember in school, there was the bell curve, right? And the bell curve identifies at the top what's sort of the most pressing, right? And in culture, we look at those ideas that are top of the bell curve as dominant ideas. Those are what some people refer to as the zeitgeist, right? Which is what everybody kind of, and again, in a culture which is, groups of people with shared beliefs and values and things like that on a national level, what that looks like is, people are all going to be talking about the same thing that's happening or the same, pieces of the conversation that they know if they're going to show up. A great example of a dominant theme is if you're going to show up at remember when we had cocktail parties, but if you're going to show up at a cocktail party and you're going to have to make small talk with people, you're going to pull the most dominant ideas because you figure they're living in the same world as you, right? Residual ideas on one side of the curve are ones that used to be dominant, but they're receding or they're waning in their potency. They may be around, but they're kind of actually tired. It's a little dated. We may still, it sort of sets the foundation for things that we call, just really familiar or comfort food or things that we just kind of take for granted in a way. There's a lot of money to be made in that. Like Walmart makes a lot of money being a very residual brand, but it's not anything anybody talks about. And then the other side, of course, of the bell curve are the ideas that are emerging. And these are typically, whereas residual ideas appeal typically to more older, conservative, more traditional kinds of customers, the emergent ideas, as you can imagine, would be both created by and really fueled by younger, more progressive audiences and often more coastal. But it's important to know with this bell curve that every company should have its own bell curve, right? Because again, if you talk to the individuals in the organization, their bell curves might all look very different, like a 3D graph. It's all happening at the same time. But then, part of, again, the job of the CEO is to align a vision of culture. Where does the brand live in culture, not just what is my personal POV of culture, so that when something happens, especially, as so many things, bad things are happening in this world, whether it's racial violence or, climate emergencies or, it just sounds like so many things happen today that brands need to speak out on, because again, brands are seen as arbiters of values for their customers. So we don't really, a lot of this is post the 2008 recession. We don't believe in the institutions so much anymore. Government has broken, infrastructures have broken. So we look to brands. Brands are the stewards now of values in this country. And so it's really, really important if something happens that there is a POV from the point of view of the brand that can speak to these things authentically. And where brands get in trouble today when bad things happen is when they don't say anything.
We have one more question, and I will just throw in this reminder that if there's anything you'd love to say, put it in the chat. and also again on social media, Linda and her team at cultique.co, co, would love to hear your thoughts about everything she's talked about. Also remember to hashtag elevate. My final question for you: there is it's commonly said, I'm sure it's been said, being said at this conference too, that there's multiple generations in the workplace simultaneously. And so at your company, you may have all five of them or all four of them all coexisting. Are they sharing one culture, or do you have to navigate five cultures to make this all work?
This is a whole nother seminar, but
I'm fascinated
generational
by it.
difference is very profound in the workplace. It's probably most profound in the workplace, very difficult for companies to navigate, which is why I think it's really important to create common bonds that exist outside of people's sort of ways of working, but to create affinities around those values so that, the great thing about the way we look at the world today, especially post Black Lives Matter, is what we call on our team an omnicultural point of view, which is very different than the multicultural point of view that had been dominant, right, which is now residual for many decades, which basically tried to create equal opportunity among races, really mostly, but didn't account for the fact that if you weren't white, that the road to get to equal opportunity was much, much harder, and there were still a lot of obstacles in your way. So the multicultural model was a white dominant model. The omnicultural model centralizes difference. So it assumes that everybody comes into a culture being very different, but having similarities. So that's called intersectionality, right? I did an exercise on an offsite yesterday where I, asked how many dog lovers were in the room, right? And, that's sort of like an interesting exercise is if you kind of identify yourself and you see how many people also identify as you, what you find out is you keep going, eventually you just get to there's just one of me, right? And so that's what the intersections are really important for, is allows people to be incredibly individual. But you know what, like I'm Asian, I may not want to I may have less in common, and I actually probably do because of my upbringing, with other Asians, and I have more in common with dog lovers, right? So that allows you generationally, the same thing is that while there might be generations, and typically it's very stratified in an organization, there are through lines culturally that you can connect and use to cultivate affinity and relationships. And right now, this is more key than ever, as you see studies that new people are coming into the workplace now during the pandemic have much less emotional attachment to the company because they're mostly remote. And even if they are going in the office a couple of days a week, it's just very different in a post-COVID era. So really mining these kinds of common values and affinities within an organization to create that very tight culture, align it with the external culture, that's the secret sauce to success.
Well, theoretically, that would be a lovely thing to want to wrap your mind around, because we all live in culture, and culture usually is responding to things we enjoy and that we share that used to be, in your real life. So this is interesting to always figure out how it gets incorporated into how we do business, how we work. And I mean, but that's, I guess, the subtext of everything that's been going
Well,
on
I think to
today.
that point, again, if you think about the employee-led movement in workplaces, that, the other thing that we're not only teaching our employees or encouraging in our employees, but we're teaching our children, which is to be authentic, to be true to themselves. And so when you have a lot of, unicorns, like, in the omnicultural model, everybody's a unicorn, everyone's unique. We just have to find those intersections where we can have commonalities. It's really, really important to do that.
Linda, thank you so much for the time and the great conversation. I've had the privilege of seeing you work many times, and I'm always learn something, and it always leaves me thinking about what's going on in culture today. It's never the same thing, so it's fun to do. But anyway, thank you. I hope all the conference attendees. Are picking up lots about the culture and about where work is going through the conference, but I'm sure they got a lot from hearing you.
I'd love to hear more.
Yes,
Please call us out on social.
absolutely. Okay. Take care,
Thank
everyone.
you.